Hello, everyone. This is Francesca Vigliani from Cloud Academy. Thank you for joining us for this office hours webinar focused on the AZ-900 exam. It's really great to see so many people connected from all over the world. Thank you for taking time away from your day to be with us. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. I'd like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you via email. And during the webinar, we will leave time for your questions, so feel free to add them in the chat box and our experts will try to answer them during the final Q&A. Okay, I'm done with all the announcements, so without further ado, let me introduce you to our experts, Guy Hummel and Tom Mitchell.
Thanks, Francesca. Hi, I'm Guy Hummel, and I'm the Azure Content Lead at Cloud Academy. For the past few years, I've been creating courses to help people pass Azure certification exams, and I have 10 Azure certifications myself.
Well, my name is Tom Mitchell. I'm really was a senior systems engineer for, I guess, 20 years or so. Got a bit tired of the on-call stuff, so I got into training. I'm the senior Azure instructor at Cloud Academy.
All right, so we have a pretty simple agenda. So we'll start off with the AZ-900 exam details. We'll basically go through the exam guide and summarize what you need to know. And then we'll give you a few exam tips, having taken these things ourselves, give you some of our experiences. And then the part that is sort of the most requested thing that we get for our webinars is sample exam questions. And these aren't real exam questions, just so you know, but they're similar. And then finally, we'll have a live Q&A session. We did get some submitted questions though before the webinar, so we'll go through those first before we get to the live Q&A. All right.
All right. So since you're here to find out what it takes to pass the AZ-900, let's take a little bit of time to take talk about what's necessary to sit and pass this exam. Now, because it's a fundamental level exam, it's really a foundation level stuff, there are really no prerequisites to sit the AZ-900. This is really the starting point for anyone who's brand new to Azure. Now, to pass the exam, you're going to need some basic cloud knowledge. You'll have to understand some of the basic concepts of cloud computing, like platform as a service versus infrastructure as a service versus software as a service. And then you'll have to know some other basics like public cloud, private cloud, hybrid. You'll need to have at least a basic understanding of most of the Azure services that are available. You'll want to understand how security and privacy are handled by Azure and how Azure pricing and support works. Now, to earn the Azure Fundamentals badge, you only have to pass one exam, and that's the AZ-900 exam we're discussing today. And while the required study time for each person is going to vary pretty widely, a good rule of thumb is 25 hours. So you would expect to dedicate 25 hours of study time if you really want to prepare for and pass the AZ-900 exam.
Right, and it really does depend on how much experience you have, first of all. So if someone is very experienced with Azure and they just needed to get the certification, then they might only need to study for, let's say, 8 hours or something like that. I actually wouldn't recommend going into this exam cold, even if you're really experienced with Azure, because some of the things that they test you on, like Azure pricing and support, are maybe not necessarily things that that technical people would know really well enough to answer the questions. So, and then if someone doesn't have any experience with Azure, they may need more than 25 hours. So it does vary a lot.
Yep.
But yeah, that's just to give you a general idea, because we do get that question a lot. In fact, that was one of the questions we got before the webinar, is how long is this going to take? Okay, so for the exam itself, it's 60 minutes long, which is a little bit unusual because most Azure exams are at least 2 hours long, 2.5, even 3 sometimes. So this is a very short exam, but it does have 40 to 50 questions on it. So that means that you only have around a minute per question. And so the questions are relatively short, Thankfully, they don't have like case study questions or things like that. But you need to go through them pretty quickly. So if you kind of get stuck on a question for a little while, you probably need to just give it your best shot and move on. We'll talk more about that when we get to the exam tips. So the types of questions that you get, if you've taken other Microsoft exams before, you'll probably be familiar with a lot of these. But Microsoft likes to use a lot of different types of questions. And so with some of the other cloud vendors, like if you take a Google Cloud Platform exam, they're going to have almost entirely multiple choice questions. Microsoft's a bit different from that. They do have a lot of multiple choice questions, but they also have these other kinds. Some of them that you may not be familiar with, like the true false with repeated scenario questions. These are on every Microsoft Azure exam now that I've seen. They always come at the beginning of the exam, again, from what I've seen. And they're deceptively difficult because even though they're true false questions, what they do is they give you a scenario and they say, okay, so here's something that you're trying to accomplish. And here's a proposed solution. Does this solution meet the requirements? And so you say, yeah, okay, that looks good. So you say true. And then you move on to the next question. They give you the same scenario again and they say, okay, here's a slightly different solution. Does this one meet the requirements? And you realize, oh, there was actually something missing from the solution on the last one, but it doesn't let you go back and change your answer for the last one. So it's really important that you look at the solution carefully and make sure that it actually does meet the requirements. And then you go next and it gives you yet another proposed solution for this one. And so you might have, excuse me, it might be that all three of them are correct solutions. It might be all three of them are false, although that's pretty rare. It's usually a mix. And you don't know what order those are going to come in or anything. So those are actually a lot trickier than they sound. And they usually have quite a few of those. So then they also have drag and drop questions, and these are sort of matching questions. So I'll try to describe this. You'll have, for example, on the left-hand side, they'll have 4 Azure services. And then on the right-hand side, they'll have 4 descriptions of services. And so then you have to drag the appropriate service over to the matching description. And so you have to do that for all 4 of them. Then there's fill in the blank questions. And so they'll give you a statement and they'll leave some blanks in it. And then they'll have some drop-down menus where you can choose from a few different answers that would go into that blank. Then they also have a series of true and false questions on a particular topic. It's usually on a particular topic anyway. They'll just ask you 3 different, let's say, true false questions, and those 3 together make up one question, right? They're all on the same page, and so you get part marks. If you get 2 of them right and 1 of them wrong, then you get 2/3 of a point for this, essentially. And they might have other types as well. Microsoft is always experimenting with different question types, so you can expect quite a few different ones. All right, so we're moving on to the exam topics. So again, we're just going through the exam guide that Microsoft provides. I do recommend that you have a look at that. It goes into more detail on these things, but what we've tried to do here is to summarize what's in that so that you can get an idea of what are the really important points to know.
Yeah, so the AZ-900 objectives are actually broken down into more main topics than most of the other exams. While the objectives for most of the other Azure exams are typically broken down into 4 or 5 main topics, the objectives for the AZ-900 are actually split out over 6 different main topics. And if you notice here on the screen, things are pretty evenly split for the most part. If you notice, every one of these top level objectives starts with describe. Now, that's because the exam isn't terribly technical. Now, while there is an occasional technical question that gets thrown in every now and then, the exam mostly, and air quoting here that you can't see, mostly test your understanding of the platform in terms of your ability to basically, I guess you could say, intelligently discuss the different Azure features and services, meaning you can describe what they are and where they fit in. Now, just to reiterate, it's mostly non-technical. Don't be surprised if you see a technical question pop up now and again. Now, that being said, if you look at this slide, you'll notice that while everything is split out pretty evenly, there is a slight focus on cloud concepts. And this covers things like terminology, cloud models, cloud types, it's platform as a service versus infrastructure as a service, public cloud versus private cloud, all the different key terms that you would expect to hear in conversation about basic cloud concepts. There's also a little bit of focus on identity, governance, privacy, and compliance. Everything else, like core services, core solutions, security in Azure, and cost management, are broken out pretty evenly. Now, all told, the exam is really broad, and to be honest, it's odd to say this, but that actually makes it a little more difficult than you might expect. I've been in an infrastructure for 20 years. I've been a senior engineer for probably 15 years of that. And I sat the exam a couple weeks ago. It caught me off guard a little bit. I mean, this all says describe, but it's more than just describe. It's more about describe it and understand where it fits in. But as you can see here, it is pretty broad. So keep that in mind as you're preparing for the exam, that there is a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, there sure is. So starting off with describe cloud concepts, and this is one of the bigger sections, and that's actually a good thing, because personally I thought that this section was relatively easy compared to some of the other ones. As long as you understand the concepts in here, then you should be able to get these questions right. And the concepts, they aren't terribly difficult. So for example, under the first one, identify the benefits and considerations of using cloud services. One of the points there is CapEx versus OpEx, and that means capital expenditures versus operating expenditures. So really what they're getting at here is that if you currently have the model of having an on-premises environment, then you're going to be spending a lot on capital expenditures because you have to buy a lot of hardware and software up front. Whereas if you use the cloud, then you're going to convert almost all of those expenses to operating expenses, because it's a consumption-based model, which is the next point there, where excuse me, you're just paying for what you use, and you don't have to spend a whole bunch of money up front like you do on premises. And the reason that they want you to know this is because you need to know what the benefits are of using cloud services. So in a sense, this is also a bit of a pitch for using Azure. And in fact, a lot of the people who take AZ-900 exams are people who are in some kind of a sales function, right? So they're maybe technical consultants, they're sales engineers, that sort of thing, where they need to be able to explain to people what are the benefits of using Azure, and then help them with understanding what they can do with it. So it kind of makes sense why that's in here. And the second part of this is describe the differences between categories of cloud services. So this is platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, and serverless. And going along with that is the shared responsibility model. And so what they're getting at here is there are these different models for using the cloud, and for some of them, Microsoft takes on the majority of the responsibility, and for some of them, the customer takes on the majority of the responsibility. There are always shared responsibilities, but the question is just how much does each party take on? And so if you understand, for example, that okay, so for software as a service, the classic example of this would be Office 365. That Microsoft is taking on almost all of the responsibility for this, and the customer is still responsible for some things. They're responsible for accounts and the data that's in there and things like that, but almost everything else is taken care of by Microsoft. At the other end of the spectrum, you have platform as a service, and the best example of this is probably Azure App Service, which is where you can create web-based apps and you don't have to worry about the underlying infrastructure. You don't have to know what virtual machines are being used to provide this service. And then in between you, or sorry, I should have said at the other end of the spectrum was infrastructure as a service. Platform as a service is sort of in the middle. But infrastructure as a service is where you have a great deal of control over everything. So you're actually provisioning the virtual machines, and you're taking care of things at the infrastructure level, but you're still not going down to the actual hardware level, right? So Microsoft is still taking care of the hardware, which is different from the way it would be if you were doing this in an on-premises environment. And then serverless is really taking this to another level of abstraction where you're just uploading code basically to Azure, and Microsoft is taking care of the rest. So if you understand those concepts, and you don't have to know much more about them than what I just said, maybe a little bit more, but not a lot more, then you should be able to answer the kinds of questions that they're going to ask about this. And then finally, it's similar with this last one, the differences between different types of cloud computing, public, private, and hybrid clouds. So if you know that hybrid clouds are basically a combination of on-premises and cloud-based services, where you're using some resources in both of those areas, that's almost all the understanding that you need to have of hybrid clouds. So these concepts, for the most part, are relatively easy to understand. They don't take a ton of time to study, and there are quite a few questions on these, so this is a good part of the exam. Oh, I should also mention that we talk about these different sections of the exam, but the exam isn't actually divided up this way. It's not like they go through all of the cloud concepts first and then they go through all the next section. It's just that these questions are mixed throughout the exam, but they're giving you an idea of how much of each of these types of questions are on the exam. All right, so moving on to the next one. Tom?
Sure. So core Azure services actually covers quite a bit. In addition to understanding the core offerings like compute and networking and storage and databases, you also need to have a good grasp of many of the different architectural components within Azure. That's kind of what you see here in bullet 1. For example, you'll probably see questions that test your understanding of what a region is or what a region pair is. Now, on top of that, you'll also encounter questions that test your understanding of what roles these architectural components play in the grand scheme of things. A good example might be a question that forces you to differentiate between something like an availability set and an availability zone. In a case like this, you'd have to know that an availability set is used to essentially protect applications against hardware failures within a single Azure data center, while an availability zone protects applications against the failure of an entire Azure data center. So you don't, it's not just about a definition, it's about knowing where these things fit in. And as far as some of these other architectural components go, you'll want to know what role each of them plays. You'll want to ensure that you know, for example, what functions a resource group plays. I mean, it's easy enough to say that you can use a resource group to group your resources together, but what else can it be used for? Can it be used to help break out billing, or can you use it to help manage administration of resources? These are the types of things that are helpful when you sit the exam to know, other than just what the definition of the service is. Now, as far as the core services go, make sure you know how to describe each of them in a way that you could explain it to someone who doesn't know what they are. That's probably a good rule of thumb. You'll also want to understand how they fit together. A good example might be a case where you want to be able to explain that a virtual machine is probably the best compute resource when you want to deploy an app where you have more control over the compute platform the app runs on, while the app service is a better solution if you don't want to deal with that infrastructure. And Guy alluded to that earlier. So the same thing goes for things like disk, networking, storage, and databases. For example, Storage, if you run into storage questions, you may encounter something that asks you, what kind of storage would you typically use to host a VM disk on? It sounds kind of technical, but that's really something that is a, I guess, basic level knowledge of storage. Would you store a VM disk in Azure Files or in blob storage or tables or queues? I mean, you're not expected to be an engineer to pass the exam, but you do need to know more than just what each service is, and you need to be able to do more than just recite a definition. And I should also mention that what you see here isn't the complete list. I know we have, virtual machines listed, the app service, and we have virtual networks and VPN gateway, and there's quite a few things here listed. But like I said before, the exam is really broad. What you're going to want to do is touch on most of the different core services and core resources so you're familiar with them. Don't just focus on what you see here in this slide, because you're probably missing 2/3 of what's out there. I mean, we just can't fit everything on a slide, and I'm not sure you want me to just read off a bunch of services. That would make for a boring day.
Yeah, fair enough. And if you look in the exam guide, you'll see more services listed for each one of these in particular. This particular slide is a little bit shortened, whereas the other ones pretty much cover everything that's in there. And also, I should note that we've bolded a few of those terms at the top, like regions and region pairs, and resource groups and subscriptions, because those are really important concepts to understand, because they're used with other resources and services in Azure, right? So resource groups contain other resources, and knowing how they work with other things is important, and subscriptions are sort of like that as well. And so those are really important concepts to understand quite well. All right. So describe core solutions and management tools on Azure. Now, I actually think that this section is a bit easier than the last one for sure. You have to, the only thing with this is that there is a broad range of services that you need to understand here. So you can see there are a lot of names on here that you need to know about. But once you have a basic overview kind of level of what each one of these things does, then you should probably be able to answer the questions in this section relatively easily, I think. In the second part of this, with the management tools, might be a little bit more difficult, not a lot. But so you need to know for Azure Portal, PowerShell, CLI, which stands for Command Line Interface, Cloud Shell, mobile app. Those are all different ways of interacting with Azure, and you need to know basically what they are, where you can use them from. So, you could use the first 4 from a Windows machine or a Mac, that's fine. The mobile app, of course, is going to be on a phone or a tablet or something. But you should know what each one of these things does. The portal is dramatically different from PowerShell, let's say. And those last ones as well, Azure Advisor, ARM templates. You don't have to get into great detail on those, but you do have to know a little bit about how they work and when you would use them.
Now, if you look at this slide here, you may be tempted to think there's not a whole lot to know about security as far as the AZ-900 exam goes. I would tell you to be careful here. I know the title says 10 to 15% of the exam is security related, but each of these topics actually covers quite a bit of ground under the covers. So what's the best way to put this? So while 10 to 15% of the exam might only be security related, that 10 to 15% might be drawn from a fairly large pool of underlying topics. To ensure that you know what you need to know, you'll want to take a hard look at these. For example, you'll want to know what Azure Security Center brings to the table. For example, you may have to answer a question about it as it relates to on-prem resources. If you didn't know that Azure Security Center provides threat protection for on-prem stuff in addition to cloud resources, you could find yourself guessing at an answer. You'll also want to know some detail around things like Key Vault and Azure Sentinel. Again, while it's easy enough to memorize a couple sentences from the overview documentation for each of these services, you probably want to be able to explain why you would use each of these rather than what they are and how to describe them. For example, Azure Key Vault generally gets used around certificates and storing passwords and whatnot. So you'd want to have a little more detail around what these things do and why you use them. And the same thing goes for other security-related resources and services like network security groups, Azure Firewall, and DDoS protection. Instead of being able to just describe these, and I'm aware that the exam objectives all say describe. That I don't like that they use that terminology because it kind of it makes you think that's just that. Just let's understand what these things are and we're good. But that's not really what happens here. Instead, you want to not only explain what they are, but also explain at a high level when you would use each of these services and why you would use each of these services. That's really the key. I mean, you don't have to be an engineer to get down into the weeds to explain that stuff. It's just you're better off knowing a little bit more than just the cursory information if you just go in and you understand why each of these is used.
Okay. Describe identity, governance, privacy, and compliance features. This is another part of the exam that's relatively big. It's 20 to 25%. It's not huge, but there are more questions on this. And it is a bit more difficult, I would say, this one. So things like authentication versus authorization. And you don't need to know a great deal about that, but you do need to know the difference. And surprisingly, it's hard to find in Microsoft's documentation what the difference is between those two things. They just kind of assume that you know or something. So authentication is basically to do with identity. So it's verifying that you are who you say you are. And authorization is what you're allowed to do within the platform. So fairly simple concepts. If you understand those things, you're probably okay there. Azure Active Directory, you do need to know quite a bit about this because this is the central, particularly authentication mechanism in Azure. And there are quite a few different components to it. You don't need to know everything because it's a very broad topic, but you do need to know conditional access, multi-factor authentication, and single sign-on at a high level. And describe Azure governance features. This is actually a little bit trickier. So role-based access control, just have a good understanding of what that does. But these other parts, and I've bolded these as well, resource locks, tags, and Azure policy, there may be some questions that ask you which of those things you should use to perform particular tasks. And they're all kind of related in a way, and so it can be hard sometimes to decide which one you should use in a particular situation. But resource locks in particular, they seem to like questions that involve those. So make sure you understand those. And let's see, on the next part, describe privacy and compliance resources. This is, this might seem like a really dry area and you're probably not going to have much on this, like the Microsoft privacy statement, the product term site, trust center, things like that, compliance docs. But they actually have quite a bit on this. And they're usually hard questions to answer because this is an area where you don't normally spend very much time on Azure, right? This is not a technical area at all. It's all about kind of the legal end of things. But you do need to understand this part. This is a part that will trip you up if you don't do some studying.
Yeah, just as a heads up, I mean, when I sat the exam a few weeks ago, I was surprised to see as many questions as I did surrounding privacy and compliance. I don't know if it's some kind of push Microsoft is making. I mean, it just seemed really peculiar. Maybe it was just luck of the draw, but I mean, it was surprising the number of questions I had surrounding, where do you go to read the privacy statement and to get compliance documentation. It was surprising. So don't be stunned if you start to see a lot of questions around that if you happen to be as lucky as I am.
Yeah, and I think it goes back again to the nature of this exam, you know, who it's for. And particularly if you're in a sales role, it would be important for you to understand how compliance works, let's say, so that when you're talking to customers or prospective customers, you can, and that's one of management's biggest concerns often, right, is how compliance works with this, because that's very important to management. And
yep.
Knowing how Azure handles those things would be really important in that conversation. So they make sure that you know those things. And I'll say that this is why, even if you've already passed a bunch of other Azure certification exams, you still have to study for this one, because it has different topics on it than you would see on any other exam. There won't be another Azure exam that has these particular topics on it. All right.
Yep. All right. So we're going to describe the Azure cost management and service level agreements. I'm going to give you a heads up here. When I sat this exam, just I don't think it was more than 2 weeks ago, 10 to 15% is probably undershooting it a little bit. I know this says that these topics comprise 10 to 15% of the exam, but at least in my case, that's a lie. When I sat the exam, I didn't see too much in terms of pricing and cost management. I did see what seemed to be more than my fair share of questions on SLAs and service life cycles. As a hint here, make sure you understand what the service life cycle has to do with the SLA of a given service. And another hint, things that are in preview don't typically have SLAs. I saw lots of questions revolving around this particular topic. It was kind of surprising. Now, that being said, I don't want to completely disregard the pricing and cost management stuff here. As a matter of fact, this objective can actually be tricky. I mean, the pricing calculator stuff, the TCO calculator stuff, that's pretty straightforward. I mean, you can go in and play with the calculator and learn how it works. I mean, that's not terrible. That being the case, however, you might encounter questions that don't get called out specifically in this guide. For example, you might want to understand how you can use burstable VMs or spot instances to manage your costs in Azure. While neither burstable VMs or spot instances, at least I don't think they are called out specifically anywhere in the exam guide, they are definitely ways that you can use to reduce Azure costs. So keep that in mind as you're going through this piece here, that, yeah, 10 to 15% doesn't sound like a whole lot on the exam, but a lot of this stuff is more nebulous. It's less concrete than some of the other objectives. So you have to pay attention here, because, I mean, if you just ignore it and you wind up with 20% of the exam, which is what it seemed like to me when I took it, you're going to struggle with a fifth of the exam. So just be aware that while some of this stuff is pretty straightforward, you know, the calculators and whatnot, keep in mind that when it gets into cost management, it's not as direct. You want to kind of think about what you can do within Azure, what services you can use, what features of Azure you can use to help manage your costs within Azure, because it might not necessarily be called out specifically in the exam guide.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so we're going to move on to exam tips now. So most of these are, or probably all of these, are things that apply to all Azure exams. First of all, check in at least 15 minutes before the start time. You definitely don't want to be late for taking your exam. And manage your time in the exam. So there is a countdown timer, and So as you're going through it, and especially because you know that you have around 1 minute per question, it's pretty easy for you to figure out whether you're sort of ahead or behind as you're going through the exam. Don't fixate on the countdown timer though. You know, it could be kind of intimidating having that clock ticking down all the time. So you can mark a question for review if it's taking up too much of your time. And so the way it works is there's just a little checkbox. You check that. When you get to the end of the exam, you can say that you want to go back to the questions that you checked, and then you can go back to them fairly easily. However, as I mentioned earlier with those true false with repeated scenario questions, they don't allow you to go back to those ones. So you can never go back and change your answer to those ones. But those are the only ones. Everything else you should be able to do that with. For remote exams, and especially these days, this is the way that probably most people are taking their exams, is remotely. There are some extra things that you need to be aware of, and it makes for a very interesting exam experience doing it remotely. So read the rules carefully and follow the instructions of the proctor. You'll have an online proctor, likely, who will be watching what you're doing during the exam, and they can be very fussy. They aren't all fussy, but they can be, and it can be very stressful if they see you doing something that they don't like. So for example, you're not supposed to cover your mouth. You're not supposed to talk during the exam. You're not supposed to look away from the screen. There are all kinds of things like this that if you were in a testing center wouldn't be an issue, right? Because they've got video cameras on you in the testing center and they can tell that you're not cheating because it's a controlled environment. But when it's your own home or your own office, then they can't easily tell that. And so they're much fussier than in a testing center. Tom, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I can say unequivocally that I am not a fan of remote exams. It's just it is stressful. I mean, I don't know why. I mean, I don't know why it is, but I mean, just when I sat the AZ-900, they stopped me halfway through and paused my exam because I forgot to take my Fitbit off. Like it's just fussy is a good term. I mean, you're going to have to show your camera around your office probably 3 or 4 times, and anytime they if they see that you have a portable hard drive on your desk, they'll ask you to remove it, and then they'll be okay, let me see your desk again to make sure you moved it. So sign in early, and if there's any instructions on testing your machine, make sure it works with the testing software. Do that stuff all ahead of time. If you have an exam at 9 a.m. and you show up at 8:55, you're going to start feeling rushed because there's probably a good 15 minutes or so of, okay, now do this. Okay, now do that. Now send me a picture of your license. Now do this, do that. Get ahead and get started early so you can do what the proctor asks. So they will be very, very peculiar about stuff. At least in my experience, they were.
Yeah. So having said all that, don't want to stress you out too much. Do try to relax. You don't have to get a perfect score. You need to get a score of 700 out of a possible 1,000 points. And you will likely get questions that you can't answer. That's fine. They don't expect almost anyone to get 100% on any of their exams, right? That's not really what they're going for. They just want to make sure that somebody is at a competent level. And so you'll run into some questions where you'll think, oh man, this is just, I'm going to fail this exam. This is way too hard. But then move on, because you'll have some other easier questions after that. It'll be okay. And also, you can retake the exam if necessary. Sure, it does cost you money to take the exam again, but if you really need to pass the exam, then you can take it the first time, get some experience with it to understand what kinds of questions they have, and then take it again not too much later. So it's not that big a deal. Do try to relax. Okay, sample questions.
So we'll start off with question 1 here. Now, remember, these questions aren't exactly what you're going to see on the exam. Again, the exam is going to have all kinds of different true, false, drag and drop, fill in the blank. I mean, you name it. But the content of these questions will give you an idea of what information the exams will be looking for. So in this example here, your company needs to deploy an application on a cloud service that can automatically add and remove compute resources to match the usage level. What feature does the service need to have to meet this requirement? So this falls under cloud concepts, because this is more of a terminology type question. So what you have to do when you're looking at these questions is kind of parse out the important pieces. And the important piece to this question here is you need a service that can automatically add and remove compute resources that match the usage level. So high availability, I mean, that will make sure your service remains available, but it doesn't mention anything about adding and removing compute resources. The same thing with fault tolerance. That's an availability thing. Disaster recovery, again, another availability thing. Elasticity, just the definition of being elastic, means stretchy almost. And if you can correlate stretchy with adding and removing resources as needed, you would know that elasticity would be the answer to this question. So the answer would be D. So that's kind of what you're looking at here in terms of cloud concepts and terminology questions.
All right, next question. Your company is going to create a hybrid application that uses both on-premises and Azure resources. These components need to communicate with each other without going over the internet. Which service should you use? So if you try to break this question down, what are the important keywords in here? So first of all, it's a hybrid application, which means, and so again, this is a concept from that very first section where you need to understand cloud concepts, right? And a hybrid application is one that uses both on-premises and Azure resources. So that's the first important thing. The next important thing is that they need to communicate without going over the internet. So if you look through these answers, a virtual network is only in Azure. It has, by itself, it doesn't have anything to do with an on-premises network. So that's not the answer. Also, D, virtual network peering, same sort of thing. That's to do with virtual networks communicating with each other within Azure. Doesn't have anything to do with on-premises environments. So you can get rid of that one. So we're left with B and C. And VPN gateway and express route both are used to connect an on-premises environment with an Azure environment. So they're both potential answers. But the key here is that you can't be going over the internet. And with VPN gateway, you're going over the internet. With express route, you're not. So the correct answer is C, express route. So you can see that these questions aren't actually all that hard as long as you understand what these services do, right? If you understand these things reasonably well at a high level, you don't have to know all the details of express route to be able to answer this, but you do need to know that it doesn't go over the internet. So.
All right, so question 3 here. Your company has a team of administrators who can create and delete virtual machines, but you want to prevent anyone from deleting a virtual machine called VM1. What should you use? You have 4 options here: Azure Policy, Resource Lock, Network Security Group, and Tag. Again, if you have at least a high-level understanding of what each of these does, this question becomes really easy. Azure Policy allows you to enforce policies on your environment. It doesn't really do anything in terms of preventing deletion of machines. So you could pretty much rule out Azure Policy right away. Resource Lock just sounds like the right answer. So I'll give away the ending here. That's your answer. Now, Network Security Group, again, if you have at least a basic understanding of even the first 2 sentences of the overview of what a network security group is, you know that this is used to control traffic. So that has nothing to do with deleting resources, including VMs. Tags, while they do apply to individual resources and even to resource groups within Azure, you know right away with a basic level of understanding that a tag doesn't have anything to do with locks either. So the resource locks, whether it's a delete lock or a read-only lock, depending on what you're trying to do with a resource lock would be the right answer here.
All right. You're creating an ARM template to provision virtual machines. You need to set the Windows administrator password for the virtual machines, but you don't want the password to be visible in the ARM template file. Which is the best service to help you accomplish this task? Now, this might seem like a sort of a scary question, right? It might seem like it's a little bit too technical, because even if you know what ARM templates are, do you know about putting Windows administrator passwords in them and how you can keep that from being visible? This might seem like a scary question, but it's actually not too bad. And the reason for that is that you can kind of ignore a lot of this. Really what you need to focus on is the fact that you don't want the password to be visible. So the password you need to get the password from somewhere else. And you don't necessarily need to know that that's how it works with ARM templates. You just need to know this is something special about protecting the password, right? And so if you look through the answers here, Azure Active Directory, well, that's definitely involved with passwords, but it's not clear how you would use that to hide a password that needs to be used for this provisioning. Azure VM Agent is, and here's the thing, you might not know what an Azure VM Agent is, right? That's quite a technical term. It's not something that's in the exam guide. And you may see answers like this where you think, oh no, I didn't study enough. I don't even know what this is. But assuming that you did study enough, you don't have to worry about not knowing some of these terms, because frankly, they're probably the wrong answer if you don't know them, if you've never heard them before, right? Because you probably should have come across it if it was the right answer. And it doesn't, in fact, have anything to do with protecting the password. Multi-factor authentication seems like a good one too, because it is involved in passwords. But again, it's not something that, it's not sort of hiding a password for you. It's just helping with the login process. And Azure Key Vault is the one that, as we've mentioned a couple times already in this webinar, Azure Key Vault is involved in storing passwords and certificates and things like that, secrets of all sorts. And so if you need to store something securely and be able to retrieve it later, Azure Key Vault is the service you need to use for that. So as long as you understand what Key Vault does really well, then you should be able to answer a question like this, which seems at first like it's maybe too technical. All right, so we still have some time left for questions. We did get some questions before the webinar, so thank you for submitting those. And I've grouped together these first three because the answer is the same for all of them. So we've got, what material should I use to study? Where can I find step-by-step practice scenarios to deeply understand the fundamental concepts? Are there any past questions available anywhere to assist in preparation for the exam? I should say with that last one, you definitely don't want to look for actual questions like on an exam dump site or something like that. It's usually a bad idea. But finding similar questions, finding practice exams that have questions that cover the same topics at least, that's definitely what you want to go for there, not actual questions from past exams. And so of course, we're from Cloud Academy, so you know that we're going to talk about our own learning path here. We have a learning path that covers what you need to know for AZ-900. It includes a number of video-based courses, a number of exams, practice exams, also some hands-on labs to address that second question on there that give you a chance to actually work with Azure. You don't need to have your own Azure account to do that. It gives you access to Azure as part of your subscription when you're using this, so that you can just go in and use Azure and learn these concepts. They're guided labs. So, and also I should point out, it says down there, average duration is 8 hours. And I think someone asked a question about this actually during the webinar. so first of all, that 8 hours isn't necessarily how long it takes you to go through the learning path. In fact, the total time for the learning path, I believe, is 11.5 hours. And frankly, it's going to take you longer than that to go through it, because you're not going to just do it all in one sitting. You're not going to, you're not going to go through it once and then never go through it again, right? You're going to need to rewatch some things. You're going to need to redo some things just to make sure you really get them. So anyway, we of course do recommend this one. And I might as well, I see questions coming in as I'm talking about this. So
yeah, I was just going to mention, there's a question about labs, Guy, about, would we recommend taking labs in context to the exam?
Yeah.
I have not seen labs on AZ-900, but I think the labs that we include, they give you a little more insight into, I mean, they provide context.
Right, that's a really good point. On Microsoft, at the moment, as far as I know, they're not actually including hands-on labs, live labs in the exams, but they were for a while on quite a few of the exams, and they probably will again before too long. But one thing you can be almost positive of is that they won't have live labs on the AZ-900 exam, because it's not at that level. They're not expecting you to be able to actually work with things in Azure. However, if you do hands-on labs like we do in our learning path here, it does help you get a deeper understanding of Azure, because when you're just watching videos or when you're just reading about Azure, it's sometimes a little bit hard to get your head around exactly what they're talking about. But when you do it for real, it really cements that in your head. So it seems like there was another one. So someone asked, where can we get practice exam questions and study material? So we've answered that. And would you say experience from one of the Cloud Academy learning paths alone is enough? So yes, I will mention one thing though that's really important, and that's at the end of the learning path, there is something called recommended reading. And we put things in there that are not covered in the learning path, but that you need to know. So if you're going to go through this learning path, you definitely need to go through the links that are in that document. And this sort of answers another question that's in here, I think. I have to find it again. Oh, just a sec here. There's a question. How do you know what's going to be included in the tests? Do you take the exams every year? So first, the short answer is yes, we do take the exams every year. I took this last year, Tom took it this year. And so we do typically have somebody take it every year. But, and also Microsoft is changing how this works so that when you renew, because you do have to renew your certifications if you want to keep them. And they've changed it now. So you take a renewal exam every year, but it's different from the way it was in the past. Like it's not the full exam. I haven't taken one yet, but that's the impression that I get. So we're going to be doing the renewal exams every year as well. And what we do is, because the exams do change relatively frequently, and Microsoft lets you know what they're changing in the exam guide when they do it. So we always notice when these changes are coming, and we check our learning paths to make sure that they still cover everything. And if we need to make a quick adjustment to the learning path, we'll make it in that recommended reading document, right? Because it takes a little while to get new content out, new video-based courses especially. And so until we have new content like that, we'll put it in the recommended reading list. So that's why that's so important. Okay, I think we answered a lot of questions with with this slide. So let's move on to the next one. How do employers really see the AZ-900 certification? Do they really value the cert? Is this the right path to start with Azure if I don't know anything about it? So this is, in some ways, this is a hard question to answer, because it's not like we do surveys of employers to find out what they think of the AZ-900 certification. But there is something else you can do, which is to go searching for job postings that mention AZ-900, which I did just before the webinar. So I went on to Indeed and I searched across the US to see job postings that mention it. And there were 72 at the moment, which across the US, maybe that's not a ton, but it's a significant number that are specifically mentioning the certification as a requirement. And it was pretty interesting actually looking through them, because some of them First of all, I expected more of the job postings to be for sales related jobs. And there were definitely some that were sales related, right? So they were sort of technical sales kinds of roles. But there were lots and lots of actual technical roles. And in some cases, what they would do is they would say that you need both AZ-900 and something else. Like there were a couple data engineer roles, I think, where they said you needed AZ-900 and DP200 and DP201, which are the data engineer exams. And I found that somewhat surprising, actually, because you'd think that if somebody had DP200 and 201, they wouldn't need AZ-900. But nonetheless, it does get included quite often. Another common thing that they would say is AZ-900 was a requirement, but it would be great if you had AZ-400, right? And so it's sort of, you can think of AZ-900 as a minimum requirement for a lot of these jobs, right? So if you can get one of the more technical certifications, that is obviously preferred in most cases, but it's still obviously a fairly well-respected certification for what it's intended for, right? Which is just having a good understanding of what Azure provides, all the different parts of it. And so you don't have to take AZ-900 before you take any of the other certifications. It's not a prerequisite for anything else, right? So you don't have to ever take it, but it's still a good one to have. I think that's probably about it for that one. And I was going to mention that actually some of the job postings were from Microsoft itself. So I thought that was pretty cool, that they do also value their own certification for jobs that they're posting. Okay, I think I'm going to hand this one to Tom.
Yeah, so we have a question here. Do you need to know all of the divisions of shared responsibilities with respect to security solutions? Essentially, I'm assuming this is in reference to the 9,000 shared responsibilities matrix that you can find online. And I wouldn't say you don't need to memorize every breakdown of the shared responsibility model. What I will say is, if you have an understanding of platform as a service versus infrastructure as a service versus software as a service versus on-prem, you probably by default would have an idea of where those responsibilities lie. For example, obviously, if you're running an on-prem solution, Azure is not going to be responsible for data center security. So I think the key to understanding how shared responsibilities break out would be to just have a solid understanding of the different as a service models, because that by default will kind of guide you in terms of what those shared responsibilities are.
Right. Okay, I think that's it for the ones submitted before the webinar. So we'll move on to the live Q&A now, and there are tons of questions coming in, which is just great. Mm-hmm. And some of them are related to what we were talking about earlier with our own learning path. And I want to sort of emphasize something, which is when you're preparing for a certification exam, it's really important to take practice exams, right? I think that is absolutely critical. And so, whether you're using our preparation materials or not, make sure that you take a practice exam. And there is a question related to that, actually. Someone asked, what % should you consistently get on the CA practice exam to feel confident to take the Microsoft exam?
Yeah, that question worries me a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. What are your worries there, Tom?
I mean, back in the day, when the way I would prepare for a Microsoft exam, and this is back in the NT4 days, I'm dating myself. I would buy the transcenders and I would hammer those things until I got 100%. Now, it wasn't about memorizing the questions, because what I really learned from was the explanations of the stuff I got wrong. So I'd keep filtering them until I got them all right. That being said, I don't know if a lot of people do it that way anymore. I think a lot of times people will just keep retaking a test till they get 100% and like, okay, I'm good to go. But yeah, that's great because you memorized 100 questions in the practice exam you just took, or 50 questions. There's probably a pool of 500 more questions, and the ones you just answered, whether it's a dump or whether it's just a legit practice exam, you could get 100% on it, but you may wind up hitting 50 questions that you didn't see in the practice test. So I don't know if I would necessarily equate a percentage you get consistently on a specific practice exam and say, okay, I got 100%, so now I can go take the Microsoft exam. I worry when people try to make that equivalency, because if you get 100% on a practice exam, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to ace the real exam. I would focus more on, if you take the practice exam, I mean, even if you get a 30% on the practice exam, if you understand why you got a 30%, that's far more valuable than just getting 100% and going and taking the real exam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's how I look at
it. Yeah. Yeah, it is very dangerous to say what percentage should give you confidence that you're going to pass the real exam, because anything can happen on the real exam, right? You might get completely different kinds of questions. Like the practice exam might, because when you take the real exam, they're sort of pulling randomly from a pool of questions. You never know what you're going to get, what's going to get emphasized when you take the exam. Right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, and so just because you did well on a practice exam doesn't necessarily mean you're going to pass the real one. So yeah, so we'd rather not give a percentage for that, but taking them is very important. And like Tom says, understanding why you got questions wrong, especially, is really important. Another one was that's sort of like related to that is, does that 25 hours include the 9 hours in the online course? And so, yeah, what I'm saying there is that, so it was 8 hours average is what it said on the course. You're not going to spend 8 hours. You're going to spend at least twice that going through the learning path, and probably more as you're reviewing. So, but yes, the 25 hours does include the time going through the learning path. And and also, does the AZ-900 cert expire? I did sort of answer that before, that yes, it does after 2 years, and then you have to take a renewal every year after that. I think 2 people asked about, no, actually 3 people asked about that. And
I see a question here about whether it helps a person get a job even if the experience is 0 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to burst anyone's bubble, but I wouldn't, if you're starting out, I wouldn't expect the AZ-900 to land you a job. If now, that being the case, if you're going to, let me qualify that, it's probably not going to land you a technical job. However, if you're a salesperson and you want to start selling Azure, and you want to, maybe you're selling some other product and you want to break into, sell for an MSP or something, then the AZ-900 may help because you can talk intelligently about it. But I wouldn't count on the AZ-900 itself to land you especially a technical job anywhere.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's something that it helps, but it won't do it by itself.
Yeah.
And is it okay to use a laptop computer for the exam, or do you need a dedicated webcam? The laptop's fine. That's what I always use. Ooh, that's a really long one. I might have to come back to that. If the CA Fundamental Cert has been achieved, can it be assumed the study commitment would be less?
That's a tricky one.
I don't understand that question.
Do we have maybe a Cloud Fundamentals? I mean, it's mentioning a Cert, but I'm wondering if, do we have a fundamentals course somewhere on Cloud Academy?
Yeah, that's probably what they mean. Yeah, that's true. There is an Azure Fundamentals learning path, and yeah, that's true. The commitment would be less if you've already gone through that whole learning path, because there is actually a lot of a lot in common between those two learning paths. So yeah, I think the answer is yes to that. From a VAR or MSP, what Microsoft Cloud Cert would be looked for or expected in the first 90 days?
I'll expect that to be a 104.
Yeah, unless you're in sort of a sales role.
Yes.
Then maybe it's the AZ-900 probably, but this is actually related to the next question, which is what's the first exam for more technical roles such as sysadmin? So Tom, as you just said, is AZ-104 is for sysadmins specifically. But it does really depend. And the way that Microsoft has set up their exams now, it's all role-based. So if you're a sysadmin, then you get AZ-104. If you're an architect, then you get AZ-303 and 304. If you're a data engineer, you get DP200 and DP201. If you're, right, there are so many different roles, and you get the one that applies to whichever role you're in. So it's great that way. I really like the role-based certifications.
I'll tell you what though, Guy, what I tell people, I've had people ask me about, DevOps and DB and all these different roles. To be honest, I tell people to start with 104. And I tell people that because the 104, I know it comes from an infrastructure perspective and it's a sysadmin perspective. But if you're going to be doing DevOps and developing solutions on Azure, I feel like it helps to understand that underlying piece. And I say that coming from an engineer's perspective. Like, I've dealt with DevOps my entire career, and I've dealt with DevOps that understand the underlying infrastructure, and I've dealt with DevOps that don't understand the underlying infrastructure, and the difference is night and day. Like, a person who's in DevOps who has that foundational understanding of how the infrastructure works underneath, they're much more effective, and they can communicate a lot more effectively with the infrastructure guys when they need resources spun up. And that's why I tell people, even if you're going to go into DevOps, it probably doesn't hurt to at least go through maybe a 104 learning path to understand it. I mean, you don't necessarily have to take the exam, but it probably doesn't hurt to understand the underlying technologies that you would have to understand to take a 104 exam, even if you're going into some other discipline, some other role. I think it really helps.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And the AZ-104 exam is definitely one of the most popular. I would say that one. So AZ-900, AZ-104, and the architect ones, which are AZ-303 and 304. Those are the most popular by far. And you're right that AZ-104 would give you a good foundation for lots of other technical roles.
Yep.
There's, yeah, so someone asked the question, would the AZ-104 learning path be better for a more technical role?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a simple answer on that one. What Azure certs do you need to get an IT technical job role? I think we've answered that. This is an interesting one. Would you rather have the CompTIA Cloud Fundamentals or this cert? I have to admit, I'm not that familiar with the CompTIA Cloud Fundamentals.
I'm not a big fan of CompTIA exams, to be honest. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I came through my career. When I got into IT, I decided that I wanted to be an expert. Like, I wanted to be like the go-to person for a few different technologies. So I went Microsoft, I went Active Directory, messaging, and now Azure. So, I mean, nobody knows everything, but when I was an engineer, if something needed to be done in those disciplines, I was the guy to go to. And I kind of feel the same way about Azure Fundamentals. Like, CompTIA just inherently is more broad, is more generic. And I mean, it can't hurt, but if you're going to get into cloud, I would pick one. I would pick Azure, I would pick AWS, I would pick GCP. I mean, I'm a Microsoft guy, so I would pick Azure. But I would think the Azure Fundamentals would be more useful, because not only are you learning the basics of cloud, because that's just part of the exam, it's part of the learning track, but you're also learning that in the context of Azure. So you're already starting off more specialized. I mean, it's nice to, I see these engineers that have certs in all three major cloud vendor spaces, the AWS's, the GCP, and the Azure. I'm not big on jack of all trades. I never have been. So I think it makes more sense to focus on one stripe and go with it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I think we'll just answer a couple more quick questions here. So there was, can we take this exam at no cost? Not that I know of. I don't think so. If you find out how, then please let me know.
I think Microsoft sometimes has, like, what are they called? I'm drawing a complete blank. I'm going to say competitions, for lack of a better term. I'm drawing a complete blank, but you can, especially like during Ignite, which was online this year, which I was not all that interested in. You could sometimes find vouchers for it, but I that's more the exception than the rule.
Yeah, and if you take an exam while it's in the beta period, then it's cheaper, significantly cheaper. But then you don't find out whether you passed it or not until the beta period's over, which is not great.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely pluses and minuses to taking a beta exam. Okay, so just one more then. I'm confused about the difference between high availability versus fault tolerance versus disaster recovery. So just at a very high level, high availability is making sure that your services will stay up even if there's a hardware failure. Fault tolerance is basically just taking that to another level, where it's like you can have multiple hardware failures all over the place and this thing's still going to stay up. And frankly, fault tolerance doesn't really come up very much. High availability is usually what you hear about. But yeah, fault tolerance is just another level. And disaster recovery is where if you do have a failure that takes things down and you're not still up, then how do you recover from that? So it usually involves things like backups and Azure Site Recovery and things like that.
Yep.
So, all right. So let me just see here. Yeah, and I think pretty much the rest of the questions here have been answered anyway. So yeah, so that's it for today. Thanks for coming. We hope you found this session useful. And before we go, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. You'll receive the recording of this session as soon as it's available. And we would truly appreciate it if you could fill out the quick survey that will pop up shortly. Your feedback is extremely helpful in understanding what kind of webinars you'd like to see more of. And again, thank you for joining us and good luck on the exam.